Good.
Yeah.
Hope pressed, fingers crossed.
Got it.
Oh, Janet Ward. Hello, Janet. It's nice to see you again.
Hello. Good to see you again too.
I was looking through the communion leaflet the other day.
Oh yes.
On the desk somewhere.
Yes, we're doing a bit of a posting round. Now we can get to places. We're hoping to make sure that it gets into all the dioceses in paper form, as well as
Good.
on. I haven't checked your website. I trust it's on your website.
It probably.
Okay.
I must check that actually.
It's,
We've only just relaunched the diocesan website.
yes. I know that it wasn't on the Birmingham Archdiocesan website, and that is being rectified now. Although the Archbishop said he would, it didn't happen.
Tell her. Yes, you can. If you don't want the video, you can switch it off. Leave the video. It's all right. Leave it. Is it? Yeah.
Hello, Grace.
Nice.
Hello, Grace.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Bishop.
Hello.
They can
Bishop
hear you.
Paul. Hello.
Hello.
Can they hear
Hello.
you?
Hello, Grace.
Yeah, they can hear
Hello. Hello.
you. Yeah, okay, they can hear you.
What I'm going to suggest for the once we get going is if we all mute, apart obviously from Jan or whoever's speaking, and what I'd like to invite you to do is to keep the chat open, and if the questions come to mind during the presentation, if you'd like to type any questions into the chat, that means we can pick them up at the end. So you can sort of make a note of questions while you think of them, but it'll enable us to do that without interrupting the flow. Is that all right? Okay. So I'll just spotlight myself to begin with. We find this works best when it's for the recording. And to begin by welcoming everyone, and especially, obviously, Father Jan, who's going to be speaking to us in a moment about the Bishop and Christian Unity, the Ecumenical Bishops of Ecumenical Vademecum, but welcoming you all, and I gather a number of people joining us from Birmingham, which is lovely. Used to live in the Archdiocese myself for a few years. It's a great pleasure to welcome Father Jan. He is our National Ecumenical Officer, has been, Jan, I think for what, about a year and a half now, is it already? Quite a while. It's sort of, oh, there's, just admit another person. It's great to have you with us, Jan. It's especially at this time when I know that a lot of your attention's taken up with the synod process and promoting that around the country. I think it will probably emerge at some stage in our discussion that the whole idea of synodality and consultation and listening is something which ecumenical work and your current what we're currently doing with the synod are both closely connected. But without further ado, I'll switch over to you. If I just get the, well, there we are, Jan. Okay, I'm going to highlight you.
Oh gosh, poor people.
There we are, and unhighlight myself. Good. Okay. But Jan, perhaps if you could, to begin with, maybe give a rather better introduction to yourself than I've given.
Okay.
Thank
That was
you very
fine.
much.
It was all good. Thanks, Bishop Paul. So yes, a priest of the Archdiocese of Birmingham for the last 14 months, been working at the Bishops' Conference, principally, as Bishop Paul said, as National Ecumenical Officer. But I seem to wear quite a few hats at the moment, and also work with the evangelization and discipleship department under our new Directorate of Mission, of which I am the director. As Bishop Paul said, I'm spending a lot of time at the moment talking about synodality. I've just come from a clergy day in Birmingham for the southern pastoral area in Bicester. I had to leave them prematurely to get back on the train. I had to make a decision where I was going to do the Zoom from, and I thought it's best to come home actually to make sure I got a stable internet. The reason I'm talking a lot about synodality is for the last 5 years before working at the Bishops' Conference, I was in Rome studying for a license in theology centering on ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, and now completing my PhD, which is on the local church and its relationship to the Petrine ministry, but has a section on synodality as well. Before that, I was a parish priest and an assistant priest, a hospital chaplain, a school chaplain, and various other things in the Archdiocese of Birmingham at different times. So I hope that's a fair introduction. Now, Bishop Paul, I just want to check how long you'd like me to speak for, because that might be helpful for everyone. I don't want to bore everyone to death, so perhaps a time parameter.
Well, thanks, Jan. I think the overall timetable will take us to about 7:30. So I'd suggest that it may be aiming for something like half an hour. Sometimes these things take longer, sometimes a bit shorter. I'll give a probably fairly short response just from the perspective of a bishop.
Okay.
And hopefully that'll leave us something like about half an hour for questions.
Oh, no, that sounds good. Half an hour is the chunk that I spoke for earlier to the Birmingham priests, so I can do half an hour. So I think actually looking at the screen, there are some familiar faces, and some of you have had the, I was going to say, the terrible fortune to have heard me speak before, and some of you, in fact, speaking about the Vademecum. But perhaps in this particular context, we have an opportunity to reflect on the Vademecum. As Bishop Paul said, and I suppose I can't move away from thinking about the synod and synodality, because that will become evident as we go through the evening. I had hoped to have completed some slides for you, but pressure of time has been, I will just apologize and say, it's better not to do them than to do something that's rushed and not good. The talk was prepared, but the slides unfortunately weren't. So as Bishop Paul said, any kind of thoughts or questions as we go along, please do put them in the chat. That will help you to remember what your question is, rather than having to think about it at the end, and then we can discuss these various things. So I have in front of me, here's a visual aid. It's actually a hard copy of the document, The Bishop and Christian Unity, an Ecumenical Vademecum, which was signed on the 5th of June in 2020 by Cardinal Koch, who is the President of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, and Brian Farrell, the Under-Secretary, Bishop Brian Farrell. And it says at the very end of it, the Holy Father, Pope Francis, has given his approval for the publication of this document. So I think the first thing to say is you will realize that all of the congregations and the Pontifical Councils in Rome work for the Holy Father, and they promote his message and his work. And so it's important to situate and say that this is a work, a document, which is given really from the Holy Father, primarily to the bishops, but to all of us, as a document that will help us to understand ecumenism. I think the first thing to say is that from the time of the Second Vatican Council, which is the prime mover really for the ecumenical world, You know, as I said to the Birmingham priests today, and I liken Pope Francis's idea of calling a synod on synodality to what Pope John the 23rd did, St. John the 23rd did at the beginning of the calling of the council. It was at the end of the week of prayer for Christian unity in 1959, when Pope John the 23rd in St. Paul's Basilica shocked the assembled masses by saying he wanted to call a synod for the Diocese of Rome and also an ecumenical council. The cardinals were completely taken aback. And I think there is a parallel in some ways with Pope Francis extending the idea of the synod, creating space for consultation amongst the whole people of God, which is a good thing when you're going to have a synod on synodality. And both what's happening in the church at the moment, and I think what happened at the time of the Second Vatican Council, are very similar. That the church, that the Pope was asking the church, all the members of the church, not just the bishops, but all the members of the church, to think clearly about how the church related to the context of the world in which it found itself in. And I think, you know, talking to the priests today, my brother priests from Birmingham, trying to work out what the synodal journey is about, we're used to having questions or positions sent down to us from Rome, of which we can listen to the questions, digest them, understand them. In the synodal process, there aren't any questions. There are just themes which are posed for the church, which help us to look at the context of where we are living our Christian faith today. Now, I mention all of this because at the time of the Second Vatican Council, and the Vademecum speaks to this, the context of the world in which we were living was very important. John the 23rd was very keenly aware that we were moving from a time of World War situations, the First World War, the Second World War, that period of time immediately after the Second World War, where nations were trying to come to terms with what had happened, trying to reconfigure themselves. And the church itself, in its own theology and its understanding of the mystery of the church, in 1943 in Mystici Corporis, you know, we had this idea of a movement in ecclesiology to think about what is the church really about? This monolithic structure run by a monarchical pope. Is it that? Or is there a different context? And so the Second Vatican Council brought many, I would say, not new things, but what it brought was a clarity of where the church was coming to theologically in a hermeneutic of continuity to speak to a context. And that context was that the church had to enter into dialogue with the world in which it lived. And ultimately, that dialogue means that we as members of the Catholic Church have an obligation to listen to and speak with and pray with our Christian brothers and sisters, but also moving into an interfaith situation as well. So since the time of the Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium sort of gave us in its chapter, in Numbers 14, 15, and 16, how the Catholic Church relates to itself and then to other Christians and to those of other faiths. Unitatis Redintegratio, the Council's document on ecumenism, spoke very keenly about how the Church would engage in the ecumenical sphere. Realistically, although what it did was it brought about a great movement of ecumenism, and those of you who have been to CTE events recently, and I know there are people in this room that have been, together with our Christian brothers and sisters recently, we've been looking at all the good things that have happened in the 20th century, and certainly since the Second Vatican Council, to help us ecumenically. But the Church hasn't given many documents. There aren't many magisterial pronouncements on ecumenism. The most recent, I suppose, is Ut Unum Sint of Pope John Paul II and the Ecumenical Directory, the Directory on Ecumenical Practice of 1993. So there isn't very much to say about how the Catholic Church does ecumenism. So what the Vademecum does is give us a context, if you like, a current day context, to say what is important about ecumenism and how we as Catholics particularly enter into this ecumenical world. So the first thing I would say is I can't tell you everything that's in this document in the next 25 minutes or so, but it is worth downloading, it is worth reading. It's a rich text, and like all texts, as I was saying earlier today to my brother priests, they need to be received, they need to be understood, and they need to be implemented. We are still in the implementation time and reception phase of Vatican II. 60 years on, we are still, perhaps we are only now in a moment where we can receive Vatican II. So this is a rich text, but it begins by saying very clearly that this is offered to the bishop because the bishop is the focal point of unity in the local church. That's not just for the Catholic community, that is for the whole people of God. So number one of the Vademecum, you know all Vatican documents are numbered, which is really helpful, but number one of this Vademecum, which also is a bit different to normal Vatican documents because it stops every so often and gives practical recommendations, which I'd like to go through some of those, because the practical recommendations particularly might help us think about our own ecumenical practices. So the Vademecum begins by saying that, it begins by quoting John's Gospel, chapter 17, where those of us in an ecumenical world are very, we know John 17 very well, that Jesus prays that all would be one, ut unum sint, that they would all be one. And the Vademecum begins by reminding us of the Lord's Prayer, that the church would be one, but also saying that it is a scandal that we are still divided. And at the end of number one, it says, and it quotes Pope John Paul II in Ut Unum Sint number 49, when it says the quest for Christian unity is not a matter of choice or expediency, but a duty which springs from the very nature of the Christian community. So that's the first thing to say about this Vademecum. It sets out very clearly the desire of the Lord is that the church would be one. The church that God created is one, but it is fractured by vulnerable, weak human beings. Pope St. John Paul II was very clear that this fracture, this disunity causes scandal, and that we enter into dialogue, and we want to have a dialogue of Christian unity because this is what the Lord asks of us, and it's not something nice to do or something good, but it is a duty that is given to us through our baptism. Now, baptism is central because, as good ecumenists, we know that the whole people of God, and Lumen Gentium speaks about this, that the whole people of God includes those who are beyond the visible confines of the church. Now, Lumen Gentium spoke about the Catholic Church subsisting in the Church of Christ subsisting in the Catholic Church, but it also spoke further on, I've already quoted in that triptych of numbers 14, 15, and 16, of the fact that we have a communion, although not a full communion, with our baptized brothers and sisters, because baptism is the sacrament that unites us all. And the Vademecum in number 2 talks about this as a real communion though incomplete. And the next part of the introduction says very carefully, again, reiterating the words of Pope St. John Paul II, that Christian unity is the concern of the whole church. It links it with synodality because, and speaking of the bishop as the principal, visible principle of unity, quoting again the Second Vatican Council, it says, the episcopal ministry of unity is deeply related to synodality. According to Pope Francis, a careful examination of how in the Church's life the principle of synodality and the service of the one who presides are articulated will make a significant contribution to the progress of relations between our churches. Now, this is important because in Ut Unum Sint and in Ut Unum Sint and in Paul VI actually speaking about ecumenism, the one thing that both popes said, and sometimes our Christian brothers and sisters don't always realize this, and many within the church fail to think about this, the Catholic Church I'm talking about here, is that the Pope said, and Pope St. John Paul II said this, if there is something within the Petrine ministry that prevents us from having unity with our brothers and sisters, then this is something that we have to think about. And Pope John Paul II went so far to ask the bishops to think about this and tell him whether they knew or could enlighten him on how this could be. So we know that one of the stumbling blocks, say with our dialogue with the Orthodox Church, which I know something about because my PhD supervisor is a Greek Orthodox layman. Part of my doctorate looks at the bilateral dialogues between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. One of the stumbling blocks is Orthodox understanding of synodality and the idea of the Petrine ministry. Yes, they understand the role of Peter in the church and in the scriptures, but they don't necessarily understand how that has been translated in Catholic theology to the Petrine ministry as it is lived out now. So that's an example. So just looking at those introductory points of the Vademecum, we get the idea. And those of us who are committed ecumenists will know that this really is at the heart of what we believe and what we want to transmit to other people. So the Vademecum looks at how we promote ecumenism within the Catholic Church. And it moves to talk about structures at the local and regional level. And here we come to talk about what we already know is happening in our own context. So I'm the National Ecumenical Officer on behalf of the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. And I relate to my ecumenical Christian brothers and sisters from the other churches at a very national level, often through the auspices of Churches Together in England. With thanks to Bishop Paul, I'm now a trustee of Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, and I've got my first meeting of that tomorrow. So at a national level, I would say the dialogues that we have amongst each other, and I'm sure many of you know, we have a dialogue with lots of our other churches, with the Methodists, with the URC, with the Anglicans, with the Orthodox, where we come together as groups of Catholics or with the other churches, clergy, theologians, laity together to discuss some of the issues of what it means to enter into a dialogue and look at theological discussions. So at one level, we might say, that's really good. You know, the Vademecum says that nationally we have to have these structures. We've got it. But we can't sit on our laurels because, as those of you perhaps who were at the Churches Together All Ecumenical Officers meeting know, we spoke about together the need to promote this in the dioceses. And the problem, or problem's a difficult word, isn't it? Perhaps we should use the word challenge. The challenge is, how do we find people to fulfill the role of ecumenical officer in a diocese? Now, traditionally, a lot of these jobs were given to the priests. That doesn't happen so much nowadays, perhaps through expediency because there aren't as many priests around, but perhaps it's a good thing that we can offer to committed lay ecumenists the ability to do this work, which is really very, very important, and to be united with the bishop in this task. The Vademecum makes it very clear that both clergy and laity need to be formed in ecumenical theology. Now, that's easier than it sounds. No, it's not as easy as it sounds. I mean, when I was in Valladolid in the 1990s learning, well, in seminary, my Christian ecumen, I think some of you, I've told you this story, my ecumenical course was called Protestant Theology. A bit of an unhelpful title for what we were actually doing. Now, I'm happy to say that title is not used in seminaries in England and Wales. And, you know, I know from, well, personal experience of the courses at Oscott, not because I've been part of them as being delivered to me, but I've partaken in them. And I speak with the Mary who teaches ecumenism at Oscott quite a lot, that would not be the way we see it now. But it's much more about forming future priests to think in an ecumenical way. But it is only part of a very broad series of subjects that our seminarians have to confront. And also we would have to say, how are we going to continue to form lay people? And this came up at CTE as well when we were talking as Catholics together. How will we form each other? How will we support each other? And again, if the Vademecum reminds us that this is our duty, then we have to form ourselves in it, because otherwise we will do a disservice to the church. We have to know what we're about. In Unitatis Redintegratio, the church, the fathers of the Second Vatican Council are very clear that we have to have our own theology in order, our own house in order, if you like, to be able to enter into ecumenical engagement. So I think what's helpful for us is to think about, and sorry about that very long-winded introduction to it all really, are some of the practical recommendations. So it's on page 12 of the Vademecum, but it comes basically at the end of the first part, where it says that, here are some of the recommendations: to be familiar with and make use of the ecumenical directory. So that is going back to 1993. That directory, I just happen to have it. Look, you see, they're always to hand, these documents. So I didn't just plant it there. It is very close to my desk here. It should, Elliot, be on my desk in the office. Now we're back in the office, so I'll put it in my bag for tomorrow. But this directory is like our Bible for how we can enter into ecumenism. To appoint a diocesan ecumenical officer. So remember, this is directed principally for the bishops. So the bishop, the ordinary, the diocesan bishop, really ought to make sure that there is a diocesan ecumenical officer who is a close collaborator with the bishop in ecumenical matters and who can represent the bishop from time to time when he can't be present. Another one, so in Southwark you have this, but not all dioceses do, to establish a diocesan ecumenical commission. Every diocese should have a commission, it says, whose task is to bring suitably ecumenical dimension to every aspect of the church's life. So this isn't ecumenism just being another part of the diocesan plan or vision, but that ecumenism is brought into every moment of diocesan life. Imagine that. To promote, now this is in the Vademecum, but this is a very long-term project. to promote the appointment of parish ecumenical officers. Now, when we spoke in Swanwick as a group of Catholics, goodness me, we were finding it difficult to find enough people to fulfill the diocesan roles. What about having someone ecumenically minded in every parish? It would be great if we could, but is that too far for us at the moment? Could we do it at a deanery level? And then it says, you know, to make sure we're familiar with what the norms are here in the directory, to ensure that there is a mandatory course in ecumenism in all seminaries and Catholic faculties in the diocese, and to ensure that courses in sacred theology and other branches of knowledge have an ecumenical dimension. To share documentation and ecumenical resources through your diocesan website. I know you were talking about the website earlier, so these are important moments. And to share news. So I think what the Vademecum is saying is that ecumenism, which unfortunately at some points in the Church's life, and even since the Second Vatican Council, has been seen as the optional extra that we just do because we think it's a good thing to do, must find its way integrated into the life of the Church in a much more real way. I personally think, I don't want to talk about this now, this may come through in the questions. I personally think that we're going to be helped in this by the synodal journey. You'll forgive me for keep on mentioning the synodal journey, but as Elliot knows, he gets it every day in the office. It is almost my constant preoccupation at the moment. So let's just, I've got about 5-10 minutes left. I really don't want to bore you with too much, because what I'm trying to do is just dip in to give you a taster of this, so that I'm sure many of you already read the Vademecum, but to reread it and to digest it and see ways in which we can encourage each other. So in part 2, the Vademecum talks about the Catholic Church and its relations with other Christians. And it says, first of all, we must be engaged in spiritual ecumenism. That means that we pray. At the basis of all we do as Christians, it has to be rooted in a life of prayer. And if we want to be engaged in the ecumenical world, then we have to pray with each other. There is, well, we would want to do that, I'm sure, but prayer is at the basis of everything that we do together as Christians. So some of the practical recommendations, I'm going a bit quicker here on purpose. Some of the practical recommendations that gives in prayer are to say, to mark the week of prayer for Christian unity. This is really, really important that in our diocese and nationally, we mark the week of prayer from the 18th to the 25th of January as an important moment. To engage with other Christian leaders, maybe we might be able to go on pilgrimage together. I know that has happened on study days. To issue joint messages, that already happens in many ways. If we are rooted in prayer, then this moves into the dialogue of love. And, you know, as someone who's studied orthodoxy and, you know, is really enamored of orthodoxy, one of the greatest things, one of the greatest fruits for me of the Second Vatican Council was that Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras lifted the excommunications of 1054, which they said were just, you know, they both basically said in the vernacular, it's a bit ridiculous that we're keeping this going. It's just a bit ridiculous. And we can't get anywhere unless we're reconciled with each other. And they entered a dialogue of charity, a dialogue of love, which preceded the dialogue of truth and the beginning of the bilateral dialogue. So Athenagoras and Paul were together famously in the Holy Land in 1964. In January 1964, they were on pilgrimage together, and they were able to lift those terrible excommunications of 1054. And they began this dialogue of love, which was very prominently given in front of the media. And it brought very fruitful dialogue. And so the Vademecum then talks that from prayer, the dialogue of love, comes the dialogue of truth. Now, I already mentioned this a little bit earlier on, but nationally, we have a dialogue of truth with our Anglican brothers and sisters, with Methodists, with the URC, with the Orthodox. We engage in a dialogue where, for example, with the Methodists, our most recent conversation was about the place of Mary in the church. It won't surprise you that when we have the English and Welsh Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue in a couple of weeks' time in November, it probably won't surprise you that we're going to talk about synodality and walking together on the way. So, from our common prayer, growing in a relationship, we enter into a dialogue of love and truth. One of the things I've appreciated most about being ecumenical officer is that because of the pandemic, this was a great blessing of the pandemic in one sense, everything was on Zoom. It was much easier to get to meetings when they were all on Zoom rather than traveling up and down the country. But I'm getting very used to tubes and trains out of London. I'm getting very adept at traveling. But when we were on Zoom, I met with my friends, the ecumenical officers of the other churches, very, very quickly and very, very often on Zoom. And we created, I hope, they were already in a good relationship. They accepted me and they brought me into the fold. And that was just lovely. And we have a great dialogue. We trust each other. We can say things to each other and we walk with each other. And that is based on prayer, respect, but also honestly and truthfully saying what our churches believe. And sometimes those conversations are awkward, but we can only have those awkward conversations if we're actually rooted in prayer and in genuine respect for each other. And the Vademecum, I'll just show you that I'm still talking about this, by the way, the Vademecum roots us in that. The final thing I'll say is, because we're running out of time, thank goodness you're all thinking, is basically that all of these things lead into practical ecumenism. And practical ecumenism, we know and have seen and probably participated in during these days of the post-pandemic. It's not even post-pandemic, is it? Why we keep fooling ourselves that we've come through this pandemic? It's as horrendous as it ever was at many levels. We keep lulling ourselves into false senses of security. But Christians are coming together to equip themselves with food banks, to look after the vulnerable and the weak, to look and acknowledge where people need support and help. And parishioners, I think very practically, are talking to each other, encouraging and supporting each other across the denominations and across the faiths. Our Muslim brothers and sisters are so on board with us with things like food banks and support for the vulnerable. These are really, really great initiatives. So the Vademecum is very clear. We have to work for unity. We have to have structures in place. We have to look at formation. We have to form ourselves. But coming from these structures, we have to engage in this second sphere, which begins in love and respect, which looks at truth, which looks at some of the challenging ideas, but always, always, always looks to the mission of the church, the whole church here, which is to make the Christ's name known to all peoples. And that is, not just the preserve of we Catholics, as we like to think at times, but that we can actually learn from each other. And sometimes we can learn some very beautiful, I was going to say home truths almost, from other Christians, because they can see into our life things that we don't always necessarily see ourselves. And in a synodal church, have we got the humility to hear what other people are saying? So in the conclusion, and I'm concluding as well now, it says, we have faced a long history of Christian divisions. this is complex. It won't be resolved overnight, and it is beyond human efforts. So that is why everything we do has to be rooted in prayer. And there's this lovely phrase in the Vademecum that says, the task of the church is always to receive the grace of the victory of Christ. And for me, that reminds me that when we allow ourselves to put Christ back into the center of all that we do, then he will enlighten us in the power of the Holy Spirit to do the things that the Vademecum is suggesting that we do. So I hope that that has given you some hope and encouragement. I hope it's helped you to understand a bit more about the Vademecum. And I hope, and I know we will, have a fruitful discussion. I got distracted slightly when I saw the questions coming through. So I know that we will have a fruitful discussion, but I'll leave it there and hand over to Bishop Paul.
Thanks very much, Father Jan. I was thinking that actually, rather than following immediately on yourself, perhaps it might be a good idea, perhaps to explore some of the questions, just to break things up a little bit. And there was one question, but there's 3 questions I can see here, which are, I think, definitely worth exploring. One sort of more theological question would be whether the document actually adds to, refines, or develops teaching from the earlier document, Tutinum Sint, Ecumenical Directory, and so on. It seems to me that in a practical way, perhaps it does. But what have you got any thoughts on that yourself?
It's an interesting question, because I think in practical ways it does. I think what it actually does is it makes us stop in our tracks to think about, you know, what we are already doing and what we could be doing. And I don't want to sound boring again and link this to synodality, but I think there is no mistake here that this document is produced almost at the same time as Pope Francis is asking the church to be dialogical. So I think what it refines more than anything is, it doesn't add anything to what ecumenism is, apart from it defines for me that this dialogue which we enter into with other Christians, other faiths, people of no faith, is actually something which we are called to do, that we can't shy away from. And ecumenism is not about making everybody Catholic in the sense that everyone just becomes Catholic and the world will be wonderful. That's not ecumenism, but it's allowing the diversity and the richness of the church to shine through. You know, someone asked me recently, it could have even been you, Robin, but I don't think it was. I'm trying to think back. You know, what would unity actually look like when we can all receive Holy Communion at the same altar, when we can all worship in the same church, when we, you know, does it mean uniformity? Does it mean we've all got to give and take too much so that we're not ourselves anymore? I don't think that is unity. Yves Congar, who spoke a lot and wrote a lot about this at the time of the council, one of my favorite theologians, talks about the idea of, I've got this book somewhere, I think that might already be in the office, I can't show it to you, diversity in communion, allowing for a diversity of gifts and charisms, which allow for distinct qualities and the gifts that God has given to people to shine through, and that brings unity in itself. And I think that comes through in the Vademecum for me. I don't know if that answers your question, Robin, but
yes, perhaps ask Robin to unmute. And one thing that occurs to me is that from what you're saying, Jan, is that the fundamental teaching is in a way just represented, but it sort of takes account of the changing context. Because in certain ways we have moved on. For instance, we're slightly clearer now about spiritual ecumenism perhaps than we were. The development of receptive ecumenism has made some progress over the years, and as you say, the context of synodality, the idea of walking together, which was the title of the latest Archic document, wasn't it? And we've discussed that at our joint bishops meeting the last time the Roman Catholic bishops met with the Anglicans before the pandemic. Let me take another question.
Paul, you asked me.
Robin, there we are. Yes,
Yes, you asked me to unmute.
Yes.
Can I just sort of add briefly to my question? Am I unmuted? Yes.
Yes.
What prompted me this actually is when I first looked through the Vademecum, it was a long time ago now, or soon after it first came out. I read particularly the bit about the procedures for allowing people who are not in full communion with the Roman Catholic Church to receive Holy Communion at the Eucharist. And it seemed to me, without doing any sort of research into previous documents, that the tone of that was rather more friendly, shall we say, more encouraging than some of the earlier documents. Now, I may be quite wrong about that. It may be that I'm just, it may be just sort of wishful thinking on my part. But I know this is a subject we've got people here who are very interested in. So it would be interested to have a comment perhaps on that particular point.
That's interesting. I mean, you're probably right that a friendlier tone is being struck, but also, I mean, I've spoken with Father Tony Curra, who works in the Pontifical Council. He's a priest of Hexham and Newcastle diocese, who works on the Anglican and Methodist desks. We were virtually socially neighbours when we were both living in Rome, because Tony lives in one of the flats at the English College. So we were able to talk about things, and he makes the point about the reception of Holy Communion, that this is obviously pastorally one of the biggest stumbling blocks, particularly, and I know, and you've hinted here, Robin, with our interchurch families. And I was with the association the other weekend, and it's good to see some of you have even come to listen to me talk about the Vademecum again. It's very brave of you. Well done. But and I know pastorally these are very, very sensitive areas, and so I think there is still work to be done for us to understand together what the church is asking of us. At one level, the teaching remains the same, which is a difficult teaching, that while we're on the road to unity, we're not quite there. And that means that there can't be full communion. However, we have to continue to explore amongst ourselves and with other Christians what that actually means, because I've just noticed another question there to say that unity is not the end goal. It is in one sense, but yeah, I take the point that we do find unity on the journey as well. That unity brings, the very fact that we do things together brings us some sense of unity. But until we are, however that unity looks, and it's a very good question, until we get there, we're still going to have this kind of fragmentation where we can't receive the sacraments together. And we have to live with that pain and tension, which is really, as I expressed in the Association of Interchurch Families, I know what that's like, because I couldn't give my mother communion, but I suppose I could have done actually, but the rules were, well, in 1998, I don't know anyway, my mom didn't receive communion at my ordination mass. So I do understand the pain and the difficulty. Whether a brighter tone is being given here, I think the fruits we have yet to see. Sorry if I'm being a bit more pessimistic, Robin.
Thank you, Jan. I'd perhaps like to add that I did notice on page 32 where it does say that what it calls communicatio in sacris is therefore permitted for the care of souls within certain circumstances, which it's mentioned earlier. But it goes on to add when this is the case, it is to be recognized as both desirable and commendable. So possibly a slight change in emphasis there. There was something that I note a comment by Ray. It's not one area where work needs still to be done. The facile way we interchangeably use what I believe are very distinct words: intercommunion, Eucharistic hospitality, and Eucharistic sharing. I must admit, some of the language that we get from members of other churches does make me squirm a bit at times. Could I also highlight, just on a point that David said, Deacon David, is it fair to say that unity is not the end goal of our journey of faith, but what we find on the journey? And I do agree with that. And that very much was in my mind reading the conclusion where, and I think you said this already, Jan, the obstacles to unity are beyond human strength. They cannot be overcome by our efforts alone. We have to trust in God. And yet, there's a huge amount that we can learn and enjoy and have our life enriched by while we're still on the journey. And I do think that there's still quite a lot of people do still think in terms of ecumenism is about the ultimate goal and the possible sacrifices we might have to make to get there. And focusing so much on that as a sort of doubtful future goal, which is seen in somewhat negative terms of what we've got to do to get there, or might have to do. Whereas our lives can be enriched so much by what we can learn from others on the journey in a more receptive sort of approach to the whole thing. Right, let's just see now. There is a question that Alex asked early on. Those of us who are participating this evening are already committed to ecumenism. How can the duty mentioned in the first number of the document be communicated to our parishes and people? That in a way also tying up with the challenge of getting what you might call parish ecumenical officers and people at the more local level, which we've struggled with in Southwark. And we did try years ago to get a ecumenical rep in every parish, but it was really, we really struggled with that. And in the end, we had to lower our sights, at least for the time being.
I think, yeah, and I think at the moment, like the Birmingham clergy were asked today to think about, getting reps for the synodal journey. And as we know, and I know from my experience of being a parish priest, often, well, one or two things happen. You ask people to do something because you discern that they would be a very good person to do it. And then you realize when you're asking them that you've also discerned that they're a very good person to do 101 other tasks in the parish. And when you ask for volunteers, the same thing happens. It's often the same people who do the jobs, and we all know that. And I think there's a bit of an imbalance there. But I think, it might be wearing my other hat now, my catechetical hat, when we talk about formation in catechesis, and Elliot will back me up here. By the way, Elliot, he's down at the bottom of my screen. I don't know whether, Elliot, would you just wave? Elliot's our mission advisor at the Bishops' Conference and joined us in June. And a great contribution he's making to the work that the department's doing. I think he may have been moved up now and spotlighted, but
Yes.
I'm sorry about that, Elliot. But Elliot will know that we face similar kind of challenges with catechesis, of getting people, you know, in every parish to be able to help with catechesis. So the first line I've always thought would be, could we do it at a deanery level, or could a group of parishes together work to find people who might be a bit more committed to helping either ecumenically or catechetically, whatever it may be. Again, I think another challenge we have, gosh, it's all challenges this evening, I don't mean it to be, is that I think this whole synodality emphasis is about how the church exists and how we do things. And some of the old structures,
No, this one says mute.
some of these old
It says
structures,
mute now.
some of these old structures need to be dismantled. And we hang on to them so that, you know, we think like in every parish, we've got to have people doing all the same things. Now, I know from when I was a parish priest that I was very lucky. I was in a very big parish in South Birmingham. We got people falling over each other to be catechists. But some of the parishes down the road were not in that fortunate situation. So we need to move out of our comfort zones and share that journey with each other. And I think ecumenically, we might need to do that as well, because there probably are quite a few ecumenically minded people around. And they might just need a little bit of a nudge sometimes. And one thing that Elliot and I have been thinking about with the bishops in the Department for Dialogue and Unity, and it's part of an ongoing project, is particularly about formation, because this keeps coming up all of the time, about how we inform ourselves about the life of faith. And, you know, if we're going to ask people to participate and do things, then we also have a duty to help them understand why it's important, what the church teaches, and how we engage with each other on this journey, if that sort of makes sense. Sorry about
one thing I might add to that, Jan, is for me the challenge is to get from a mentality where working ecumenically is seen as something which takes energy, to thinking of it as something which can give energy. There are quite a lot of things like that. I mean, when you think, I think about preaching, for instance. You know, when you're preparing a homily and you're sort of working away, and you know, you've got to find the time to do it, and yet the whole activity of doing that and actually of preaching as well itself is something which can also be very energizing. So it's sort of it's trying to get that sort of mental shift, I suppose, and that's not always going to be easy. But it seems to me that approaching it from that direction could be a more positive way of presenting it, let's say. Anyway, perhaps I might. The plan I had originally was to maybe for me to share a few. I'll just unspotlight Elliot now, save his embarrassment. Where are we now? There we are. Was to, bearing in mind what Father Jan has said, to pick up a few sort of practical things that are happening or are going on, maybe in my own diocese of Southwark or elsewhere. So if I'm just looking through the notes that I've made here, I suppose the first thing I'd want to say is that actually the thinking about a synodal approach to things and being open to listening and allowing ourselves as a church to be questioned and to admit that we may need to change in various ways. All of that is not easy, but at the same time, I mean, I've found working ecumenically for a good few years now, that it is actually very creative as well and very enriching. And I found that from my, working with churches together, and also interfaith dialogue, even to a certain extent nationally. I'd like to pick up a couple of things from the document. On that note of thinking about ecumenical dialogue in a positive way, it seems to me that, and it sort of suggests to the document really, that, or it said in the document that ecumenical dialogue doesn't imply abandoning established truths. It doesn't mean abandoning things that we know are true and that we believe very firmly. Very often it's a matter of accepting truths which perhaps we've neglected in some ways, or we've held to them theoretically, but perhaps not been so good in practice. The obvious one is the role of Scripture in our lives. That's always been a fundamental part of our faith, but we've discovered that much more as a practical aspect of our life in the liturgy and in our spiritual life. But thinking of some examples, I'm thinking of the part where it says Christians coming together and praying. A lot of examples of that, particularly locally. I'm one of the sort of organising group of Croydon churches together, and I've noticed that through that local group, there's been a big impetus to when there be things like the riots in Croydon, or the coming together in response to the whole issue about the murder of George Floyd last year, and all sorts of, when crime has been a particular issue, and in response to people struggling with the financial crisis some years ago, all sorts of things like that, where it has brought Christians together to pray. And in fact, our evangelical and charismatic brothers and sisters have been very, very strong on that. And I think that's been an inspiration. Mention of pilgrimage, Robin and Barbara too will remember the pilgrimage we had to the Holy Land with the Southwark Roman Catholic Diocese and the Southwark Anglican Diocese. And I'd just like to mention very briefly our experience there, if I can sum it up in a few words. I felt that our experience of our feeling of communion between our two churches and the Anglicans and the Catholics on the group, that our feeling of communion with each other was really strengthened in a strange way, even through celebrating the Eucharist together, despite the fact we weren't able to receive Holy Communion. So we would attend their Eucharist and they would attend ours, and we felt drawn together very strongly through that. Experiencing the pain of division, and yet also being very much present to each other in that moment. Let me just see now. There is a mention of the ecumenism of blood, as it's sometimes called, honouring Christians from other traditions who have suffered martyrdom. Now, there was something that came to mind for me there very, very powerfully. Not that he's actually a martyr, but I've worked with the Père Laval Association, that great Mauritian saint Jacques Laval. Been very struck by the way that devotion to one really holy person has brought together all different denominations in Mauritius. My experience of them is Mauritians over here, in London, but bringing together Christians of all different churches and members of other faiths, Muslims, Hindus, all sorts really, and it's so moving really, the way that devotion and being inspired by one really holy person can be a huge unifying experience for people. Let me just see now. There is mention of the importance of personal friendship and the dialogue of love, as it's called in the document. And that calls to mind, although it's quite a few years ago now, we'll all remember the example of Derek Warlock and David Shepherd in Liverpool, and how that's been an inspiration even up to the present time. And there's various other examples of that. I've been very lucky to know my Anglican opposite number for many years, the Bishop of Kingston, and we were students together years and years ago, long before either of us thought of ordination or anything like that. And I think, we do find that pastorally, as parish priests as well, that working together with pastors from other churches, building up trust, learning from each other, and the encouragement that we receive from each other is something that is extremely, extremely powerful. I've noted the joint bishops meeting already. Maybe one other thing I was going to mention in church families, Father Jan's already done that. But one final thing perhaps to mention is when it talks about the dialogue of life and wanting to do together as much as we can do, the Lund principle. Anything that we don't have to do separately, we should be doing together. And it seems to me there's still plenty of room for improvement. Over the last months, we had a meeting of the bishops of the Southwark Anglican Diocese, Bishop Christopher and two of the area bishops, and then Archbishop John, our Archbishop, plus myself, wanting to explore the different ways that we organize things in the diocese, the way that the way that we go about things, the different departments. And it sounds a bit boring in a way, but I think that if we can be more aware of how the other system works, so to speak, the different organization and the things that they do, we can learn from each other, but also we can be much more aware of what we could do together. And it so rarely happens that when we Catholics are planning something, it's fairly rare for us to ask the question at an early stage, could we do this ecumenically? And one of my great friends, the late Canon Bill Clements, he was a parish priest over in the Thamesmead Ecumenical Project many, many years ago. We were in the same support group, and he would always remind us to ask the question, can we do this together with others? And it seems to me we're working on it, but we've still got quite a long way to go. Perhaps I'd better stop there and leave room for some questions. And I see some more questions have come through. Barbara says, I've been attending some catechesis at an Anglican church in Croydon, St. Michael's, and the priests and other participants have been very welcoming. The impetus towards unity, Janet Ward, the impetus towards unity, which is often found strong in dialogue compared with Anglicans, seems often lacking in engaging with the free churches. Perhaps it's more challenging for everyone. Is this a common experience? Perhaps I could invite Jan to maybe comment on that. I could perhaps comment on that myself afterwards. I should perhaps also say that I'm forgetting here that I have invited Robin to sort of chair the question and answer session, mainly because some of the questions may be addressed towards myself. So I'm going to see if I can pin or spotlight to spotlight Robin, and then there we are, Robin. Okay, let's add spotlight. There we go.
Okay.
So Jan, perhaps over to you, and then I'll hand over to you, Robin, to chair the rest of the proceedings.
Okay, thanks.
Just checking I was unmuted. I'm trying to think about Janet's question. I mean, this isn't a cop-out to say I'm going to let Bishop Paul answer it, but I'm not sure of the answer there. I mean, I can say personally, actually, probably at a national level, you know, I engage as much with the free churches as with the Anglican Church. I think sometimes one of the difficulties can be that I think with the Anglican Church, there's some very defined similarities and differences which are very easy to see our way through. With the free churches, sometimes there's a lack of definition, I suppose, theologically on a free church side, which I suppose perhaps, I don't know, Janet, whether that's some part where you go to make it a bit more difficult. But I would say it doesn't stop the engagement. Perhaps it's just different.
Would it be a good idea to ask Janet to unmute and see whether she wants to fill her question out a bit?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, well, this is partly from my experience in the Chapel of Unity at Coventry, and partly locally. But as you say, there is a commonality, isn't there? A great deal of commonality between the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church. And although a lot of the free churches have moved towards, for example, the use of the lectionary, which used not to be the case, and so on. So we do share more, but it is the plethora of other churches, if you like, not just the name, the Methodists, the United Reformed Church and the Baptists, who are the mainstays, but all the multitude of other churches who have a different way and very often independent. So engaging with several independent churches within an area can be quite difficult. But it's just that yes, we have less in common, in a sense, naturally less in common, but not necessarily less in common in our faith in on our redemption, if you like, that Jesus came to save us.
Could I ask, are you thinking of things like sort of written prayers and free prayers, as it were, which is the Anglican and Roman Catholics are both have a tradition of liturgical prayer, which is largely absent, I think, from the free churches. And on the other hand, free prayer is something which we don't do. We do it more than we used to, but still not very much.
Something I learned from my African parishioners in a certain sense. So when I was a parish priest, but I guess because we've got very similar structures to the Church of England, it does mean that working together in a practical way can be quite fruitful. And particularly because in my case locally, we've got two dioceses of the same name and two cathedrals fairly close together. It does mean that from a practical point of view, there's a lot of synergy there.
I was just thinking the enrichment of going on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land with people from other churches would be very rich, and their response would enrich us, and ours would enrich them, hopefully. Whereas the enrichment that came with sharing with our fellow Anglicans, if you like, our Anglican fellow Christians, it's more, yes, it's diverse because the Anglican Church is diverse. but I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that our church too is diverse.
It's difficult to keep up with all. It's difficult to keep up with all the Pentecostal churches, and this is a bit of a challenge that we've had in churches together in England. We've had some very good people in CTE maintaining and establishing those relationships, and many of them have become members of CTE. But it's a fairly rapidly changing landscape. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that, Jan. That can be a challenge at times.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think, but I think certainly at the level of churches together, some of the newer churches, or the younger churches, I suppose could be a way of putting it as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think the one thing, I think something came through in the question, the one thing obviously that does hold us all together in being is our, I would say, common use of the scriptures, although again, that in itself can provide differences because of the way that our own tradition has interpreted the scriptures, and in the free churches is often, well, a freer interpretation scripturally. But I'll stop there because I think Robin wants to.
Well, I was just going to say that there's Rosamund Suliak has raised exactly this point, as you will see, that she asks, it should be common ground, the Bible should be common ground to Roman Catholics, Anglicans and the free churches. But how well do Catholic lay folk know the Bible? All through. I'm not quite sure what all through means here, but again, Rosamund, perhaps she should expand on that. Where is she? Can you unmute yourself, Rosamund, if you'd like to? Don't worry if you don't want to. Oh, she's not there.
Perhaps I could respond to that actually, because I mean it's one of the things that's been a great sign of a great encouragement to me over the years is actually the way that biblical scholarship has become very what's the word? Sort of something that we've got very much in common. All the churches really. I use a 12-volume Bible commentary, which is pretty comprehensive, and it was published by the Methodists, but it's got Catholic authors, Anglicans, various free churches, and contributions from people from very different backgrounds. And scholars will differ obviously in their opinions about various things, but it seems to me that there hasn't really been, over the last few decades, there hasn't been what you might call a sort of church-based bias, to the scholarship. That it's something with the methods, the sort of academic processes, the scholarship is something which is very much in common. I don't know if you would, if that's your impression, Jan?
Yeah, I think so, actually, Bishop Paul. I think, and I suppose I can admit here that I do use scriptural commentaries from other Christian traditions and look at other understandings, but then I suppose you'd expect me to, as being an ecumenist, but conversely, actually, anecdotally almost, I'm sure many of you are appraised of the Jesuit Pray As You Go app, which I was introduced to. Yes, I did know about it, but I was encouraged to use it by the National Ecumenical Officers, by some of my friends, and so each day I listen or try to that 15-minute meditation, which I find very helpful. But I also know that some of my friends, the ecumenical officers, are also listening to it. And I think, the fact that we are sharing those resources, whether they be from a Catholic tradition or from other traditions, and that we're actually praying often same kind of prayers, but in a different way, in our own different contexts, is very, very helpful as well. And so there's that willingness to share with each other. And I think that's a very good thing.
Good, thanks. I had a question about, I don't know whether Bishop Paul would like to respond to, how can bishops, qua bishops, best use their position to make a personal contribution to ecumenism?
Well, I suppose I mean, there's lots of ways in which we do engage ecumenically, but I suppose in a way, in terms of what we're talking about here, I suppose it's not, we have the opportunity of making it, working ecumenically to give it a higher profile publicly. I suppose that's what distinguishes, you know, that's something that we can do, which perhaps other people and other clergy perhaps can't do so easily. But you know, so I suppose taking the opportunity of having certain high profile events. I mean, most of the work does go on behind the scenes in a fairly quiet way. I do try to use examples from local ecumenism, like I mentioned Croydon, for instance, you know, when I'm talking to people at national level and vice versa, just to help people to become aware of what else is going on in the ecumenical landscape. Whether, I suppose, perhaps what I ought to be doing, and whether I do it enough, I don't know, is maybe to do what my friend Bill that I mentioned earlier. He was always reminding us in the support group, and perhaps people like myself, when bishops get together, that we can remind each other to ask that question of what can we do together that we don't need to do separately. What are the opportunities we could take to give ecumenism a higher profile, to work more closely together with people from other churches? I don't know whether you'd like to add to that, Jan?
Well, I'm not sure I'd like to instruct the bishops how to do it, but what I would say to everyone is that actually, you know, the current work I'm doing affords me a great insight into what Bishop Paul has just been saying, that a lot of the work does go on actually behind the scenes. But I think, you know, some of those higher profile events, and again, I think the context of the world that we're living in offer us those contexts. You know, certainly our younger Christians will be happy for their bishops to put climate change and our stewardship of creation right at the top of the agenda. And that is, you know, something that I know the bishops are already doing ecumenically, and with COP26 coming very, very soon, you know, that is something. And I think also we've seen it with the tragic events, you know, of Sir David Amos's murder over the weekend, that the faiths are very good at coming together. The Christian traditions are good at coming together to provide support and opportunities for the community, and oftentimes people who are not understanding really how to pray or why it's important. The bishops do that, and I think that rests a lot of the time because they have formed such very, very good relationships, which, as Bishop Paul says, are so often behind the scenes. Perhaps sometimes the bigger gestures, like David Shepherd and Derek Warlock, perhaps they need to be shown a bit more. I don't know. I wouldn't like to say that to the bishops, but you know, that relationship of Derek Warlock and David Shepherd is talked about to this day in Liverpool. Archbishop Malcolm, you know, when I'm speaking to Archbishop Malcolm, he always wants to talk to me about ecumenical things. And after the synod they had in Liverpool, said, you know, the reason people at the synod didn't mention so much about ecumenism was because it's good in this city, because everyone remembers the powerful witness of those two men. So I think both and is really, really necessary. It's already happening, though. It's already happening. Sorry, Bishop Paul.
Sorry, yes, on David Warlock and Derek Warlock and David Shepherd. Of course, I can never remember the chap's name, but there's the Free Church leader, wasn't there? And the way that they eventually realised that they always needed to have him in the middle so that he wouldn't get cut out of photographs. Robin, sorry.
Yes, I was just going to say, I think we need to wind up very shortly, don't we? But I've just noticed a comment coming from Teresa Chance. Perhaps our fellow Catholics in the charismatic tradition would find it easy to connect with fellow Christians in the Pentecostal and Free churches. I don't know whether either Bishop Paul or Father Jan have any comment on that.
It is happening, and Pentecostals that I speak to, quite mostly often at churches together in England, they're very much aware of the the Catholic charismatic movement, and feeling a great connection there. A little while ago, this is before COVID, I went to, I don't know quite what they called it, but it was like the equivalent of an installation of a bishop. I don't think they called him a bishop. This was the Cherubim and Seraphim in somewhere in South London, and I went along to that, and it was quite an experience because it was a combination of Pentecostal style worship with a certain amount of liturgy, and it struck me that it sort of felt a little bit like a combination of the Legion of Mary and the Boys' Brigade in terms of it was quite a strange sort of mixture, but it was obviously they'd sort of borrowed from various traditions, and but it was a great experience. Jan.
No, I don't think I can add very much more than to say I think it is happening, and I think perhaps it's sort of again, there's a learning there, as we've just said about the free churches, perhaps having a lectionary, I think, again, charismatic Catholics and Pentecostals can offer things to each other. But, it's quite funny that, this isn't particularly perhaps a charismatic hymn, but, in ecumenical settings, you often sing "Be Still for the Presence of the Lord." And in Catholic settings, it's often used for Eucharistic adoration. And it's interesting how a hymn like that can be interpreted in different ways and used both in their own traditions, in our own traditions, and ecumenically. So I think there are crossovers, and I think little by little, actually we are learning how to do this. It just takes time, doesn't it?
Perhaps one other thing that occurs to me on that is that I won't go into the details, but there's a thing called the Churches Together in England Forum, which happens once every 3 years, and some of you have been to it. The last one, I think it was the last one, there was a particular focus on both Pentecostals and the Orthodox, partly because there've been a number of new memberships from those traditions. And one thing that was quite striking was the commonality between them in lots of differences in terms of style of worship, but a surprising similarity in theology and various other aspects. So it's surprising what comes up sometimes.
I think we're due to finish at 7:30, aren't we? So perhaps perhaps I could just say very briefly that the reason I keep popping up is because I'm the lay chair of churches of the Christian Unity Commission in Southwark Archdiocese, which is actually organised this event. I should have introduced myself earlier, but perhaps I can pass back now to Bishop Paul to wind up the proceedings with such assistance from Father Jan as he feels necessary to call on.
Thanks very much, Robin. And yes, just to finish by thanking Jan very much indeed. It is very important to us on the Southwark Commission to offer input on a number of topics from time to time. It arose out of something that we offered originally to our parish ecumenical reps, Very much appreciated, particularly as I said earlier, bearing in mind how busy things have been for you, Jan, just at the present time. And how long have you been in post actually? Is it a year or?
Just over. So September 2020.
Yeah.
When I started.
But I mean, my one, my strongest impression at the time was that you definitely hit the ground running. No doubt about that. So I do really appreciate it, and thanks to everyone for participating. Perhaps we might all unmute just to finish things off, and perhaps say sotto voce, perhaps for technical reasons, say the grace together. The grace of our
Lord Jesus Christ,
and the
the
love
love of God,
and the
fellowship of the Holy Spirit
be with
us all.
evermore.
Amen.
Goodbye, everyone, and thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
God bless you.
Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.